20 years of incredible animation, lovable characters, and lots of leaks.
New Precure just leaked. Cure anxiety.
It's the 20th anniversary of Pre-Precure. For 20 years now, we've had an annual Precure anime release with no signs of stopping. But before season themes and colors became a highly debated topic, we had black and white. 2004's Futari wa Precure is a monumental milestone in the magical girl genre. It debuted what would become the longest-running magical girl anime of all time, and it did so by refining the magical girl formula set by Sailor Moon to perfection. Let's celebrate 20 years and see how it all began.
So I put the lesbians in the freezer, and these are frozen lesbians. Oh my god, I can't wait.
I got a new set, and we're in widescreen now too. Only took me like 3 years. But I'm back. Not that I've gone anywhere, my videos just take a very long time to make. A large part of that is doing research and looking into the careers of the creators. This video is mostly going to be about the history and surrounding context around the first season of Precure. For those unfamiliar with the series, Precure is Studio Toei's annual magical girl franchise. Natively, it's absolutely huge in Japan and also has a pretty sizable cult following in the West. So much so that the r/Anime Awards jury picked Todo Precure as Anime of the Year in its respective year of 2019. To put that into perspective, it beat out the likes of Vinland Saga, Demon Slayer, and Attack on Titan. That's no slouch. It's also a pretty good representation of Precure status in the West. People who are in the know will sing its praises as one of anime's best franchises. A lot of Precure fans aren't just casual fans of it, they stan it and can tell you every small detail about their favorite season, from their favorite cures to their favorite villains. They can dance along to their favorite EDs and sing the openings. With every season having its own unique theme, you're bound to find something that appeals to your sensibilities. The currently airing Wonderful Precure, for example, has an animal theme which is sure to appeal to any pet owner. But if you're more into space and astronomy, then Star Twinkle Precure might be for you. Or maybe you love the feeling of summer and warm sand, then Tropical Rouge Precure is the one you're looking for. Heartcatch Precure is generally considered to be the all-around fan favorite within the fandom, but I say you start with whichever one looks the most interesting to you. Everybody has their own tastes and preferences which may not align with yours, and that means you could get turned off from watching a season you otherwise may have liked. I for one really love Kira Precure a la mode, but it's a bit more divisive within the fandom. Go at your own pace and don't let the episode count deter you, because soon enough you'll be glad it's as long and expansive as it is. Remember, you'll only know if you like something by trying it out yourself, so have fun with it. I've made this video with the intention that anybody can watch and enjoy it regardless of experience, but my intended audience for this video is hardcore fans of Precure and magical girls in general. That being said, I won't go into spoilers for any of the other series I'll be talking about in this video, and for any of you who have not yet seen Futari wa Precure, or haven't seen it in a long time and want a quick reminder, let me give you the rundown before getting into its history. Nagisa Mizumi is Veroni Academy's ace player on their lacrosse team. Though highly agile, her academic skills leave a lot to be desired. She remains popular with girls who admire her athleticism, but only to Nagisa's dismay because she gets teased for it and wishes to find a boyfriend. Her polar opposite is ace student Honoka Yukishiro. They meet each other by coincidence through a talk of a meteor shower happening soon. Honoka overhears Nagisa and her friends talking about the meteor shower, claiming it to be an ill omen. Honoka explains to Nagisa that that isn't the case at all, and she can make a wish instead of worrying. Making an impression on Nagisa, she later wishes upon a shooting star that just so happens to be directed towards her apartment. Instead of a meteorite, a cell phone and a deck of cards lands in her room. Inside of the cell phone is a fairy named Meppel. He is the protector of the Princess of Hope, Mippel, whom Honoka found in her garage. Mippel and Meppel are in possession of 2 of the 7 prism stones. The Prism Hopish, with all the stones gathered, holds the power of creation. This is what the aptly named Dark King from the aptly named Dark Zone wants to get a hold of to gain invincibility. His 5 henchmen are in possession of the rest of the prism stones, which Cure Black and Cure White need to get back. Nagisa and Honoka become Precure through the use of the Card Commune, a function in their cell phones that allows them to summon fairies from the Garden of Light and transform into Precure. With the power of their new magical girl transformations, they fight the evil Dark King and his 5 minions to retrieve the missing prism stones and restore peace on Earth. It's a simple yet effective setup for the series. There's a lot of fun twists and turns throughout the story that'll keep you engaged. They don't give you all the details immediately out the gate either, which I appreciate. Bits and pieces of lore get revealed episode by episode, which gives the show an air of mystery to it. Even 20 years later, on a second rewatch, I found myself thoroughly enjoying this first iteration and appreciating the passion the staff put into it. The building blocks for a great franchise are all here, and each subsequent season only expands upon an already great formula. The tradition of the villain creating minions out of the creatures and objects around them, transforming them into big, evil, and silly-looking versions of their original forms starts here, and is part of the joy of watching Precure to this day. But it's the simplicity and timeless writing of the first season that many fans still gravitate towards to this day. Before the series became more about the 5-piece ensemble teams, Nagisa and Honoka had one of the most beloved and tight-knit friendships in anime. For as great as Precure is and has always been, we have Futari to thank for all of it, and it's about time the people get the credit that they deserve, beginning with none other than the creators themselves. The creator of the Precure franchise is Izumi Todo. Izumi Todo is not a real person. So who exactly created Precure? Let me explain. Sometimes people will use what is called a pen name when they're working on something. It's basically what you use if you want to remain anonymous in the credits. There are many reasons why someone may want to do that, but in the case of Izumi Todo, it's because it isn't just one person behind it. Izumi Todo is a revolving door of creators under the umbrella of Studio Toei. This is to manage copyright when selling toys, wands, dresses, and whatever else to fill out your magical girl asylum. Oh, sorry, my heart belongs to Clamp. Other notable examples of joint pen names include Hajime Yatate and Saboru Yatsude for Studio Sunrise. Toei is of course most famous for their many adaptations of popular shonen and shoujo manga. So Izumi Todo is what they use for most of their original projects, beginning with Magical Doremi in 1999. It tells the story of the self-proclaimed unluckiest pretty girl Doremi Harukaze, or Dori in the 4Kids dub. Her parents are constantly fighting, her sister Pop always teases her, and she has little luck trying to ask out her crush at school. But she learns of witches and begins to study them, wishing that with the use of magic she can solve all of her problems. So when she actually finds a witch named Rika that fits all the criteria she read in her book, she calls her out for being a witch, turning her into a witch frog. In this form, she must train Doremi into becoming a real witch by making her pass the witch exams so that she may return to her original form. What follows is 4 seasons of magical mishaps, meeting new friends, and eventually a slot in your favorites list. Like, you know how Earthbound's tagline is "no crying until the end"? Try doing that with Doremi. I dare you. Don't mess with us Doremi fans. We will cry. While being a new IP, Doremi is more of a throwback to the studio's early days of girls animation with their Witch Girl line of series. Doremi strips back the Sentai action that was popularized by Sailor Moon and is more centered on everyday problem solving. Magic is used for said problem solving instead of combatively, as the series doesn't really have much of a villain to speak of. The team wanted to focus on universal themes so that they could continue the series if it turned out successful. Less to say, Doremi was a massive success for Toei, being the 3rd longest running magical girl anime of all time, behind Precure and Sailor Moon. It was also Toei's first original production for girls in 15 years since Wee Wendy in 1984, which itself was important for kicking off the Sunday 8:30 AM time slot on Asahi Broadcasting. This is the same time slot that Precure still airs on to this day. But before Precure was dominating it for the past 20 years now, there was a solid variety of shows airing. Not all of them were targeted towards girls either, so there really wasn't a consistent theming until the trendy drama trilogy with Marmalade Boy, Neighborhood Story, and Boys Over Flowers. These had all been adaptations of popular shoujo manga, but when producer Hiromi Seki ran out of manga that caught her interest, she turned towards literature.
I had done 3 trendy drama series before, and when I couldn't find any more original manga that I wanted to work on, I decided to go back to children's programming, and a wonderful work of children's literature caught my eye.
The book in question was the Crayon Kingdom series, dating as far back as the 1960s. Toei's animated version was the first ever anime they made fully digital from episode 1. Digital techniques used in Crayon Kingdom would gradually evolve and develop in the future Doremi and Precure. Author Reizo Fukunaga was also pleased and allowed them creative freedom. After the show was extended by half a year, Hiromi Seki began developing Doremi with Junichi Sato, making them part of the first generation of Izumi Todo.
Planning an original work had always been a dream of mine since I joined the company, and it was thanks to the strong support of Asahi Broadcasting's producer that I was able to do it. He highly praised my previous work, Crayon Kingdom of Dreams, and said, "It's okay as long as we have the same director and scriptwriter." Thinking I may never get a chance like this again, I decided to do what I wanted to do with all my might and started meeting with the Doremi staff.
Fortunately for Seki, Doremi would not be her final original project. A commercial would be made in which Doremi would pass the baton over to the next show in line, Tomorrow's Naja. If Doremi was a throwback to the Majoka lineage of the 60s and 70s, Naja is a throwback to World Masterpiece Theater. It was Nippon Animation's annual series where they would make adaptations of Western literature, such as Haiti of the Alps, Anne of Green Gables, and what Naja is probably most influenced by, 3000 Leagues in Search of Mother. Other studios such as Studio Madhouse in their early day would try a similar format with the likes of Nobody's Boy Remy and Tales of Magic. So it was a hugely popular format with international appeal, which is what Toei tried to emulate. Tomorrow's Naja isn't actually an adaptation of a piece of literature, rather it's an original story about traveling the world. Naja Applefield is an orphaned girl who on her 13th birthday receives a parcel containing a briefcase. Inside it contains a beautiful dress, a diary, and a letter. She learns that her mother might still be alive, but disaster strikes when some crooks try to steal her brooch and cause the orphanage to burn down. Naja now has no choice but to leave the orphanage and go off on her own. She eventually meets up with the Dandelion Troupe, a traveling entertainment act where Naja becomes a dancer for them. As they travel the world, they find more clues about her mother's whereabouts and get into plenty of troublesome encounters. With Naja, Toei clearly wanted international appeal. While the series did release in parts of Europe and Asia, North America only got a couple compilation movies in English. It wasn't given a proper chance to flourish in the US unlike Doremi, but Naja was seen as a financial disappointment even in Japan. That is no fault of the show itself, because it's incredible, but rather it was simply too ambitious in trying to create a grand narrative. If you missed an episode as it was airing, you miss out on a lot of important story details. This made it hard to follow unless you were watching it from the beginning. The show, in my opinion, is also maybe a bit too sophisticated for children. Kids aren't dumb and obviously deserve to watch great shows growing up, but Naja? It's an historical drama at a time where technology was rapidly evolving. You started to hear more about the internet, and flip phones were getting really popular. Video games were becoming more accessible, and fashion was increasingly important. Heck, World Masterpiece Theater had already ended its 2-decade run a few years ago. This type of show was long out of fashion. Tomorrow's Naja was yesterday's news, and the competition at the time was fierce. Young girls were into stuff like Full Moon, Tokyo Mew Mew, and Mermaid Melody, which had way better marketing. In fact, what Naja reminds me of the most is Princess Tutu, another classical anime with a massive cult following that still fails to see much success. But even if it did have better marketing, I think the problem still boils down to its serialized nature and setting. You can tune into just about any episode of Doremi and enjoy it on its own. The toys were so good and varied, but also didn't completely look out of place in the show itself. Some of Naja's items stand out with comedic garishness. Like, these are not the colors I'd imagine seeing in the time period this show takes place in. Whew. Okay, worst of all, the show ends on kind of a weird note. Without spoiling anything, it leaves you on a bit of a cliffhanger with no sequel in sight. Until 2017, following Naja after she turned 16. Wait, hold on, isn't that just like Clear Card? I cannot believe they just pulled a Clear Card. I joke around, but do know that I genuinely love this show. Watching it was the most excited I had felt watching an anime in a very long time. I can say I wish it would have done better, and maybe in an alternate timeline it would have, but we don't live in that timeline, and I can accept that. Tomorrow's Naja simply suffered the ultimate first world problem, being too focused on just being a great show and overshadowing its products. It'd be like me as a YouTuber being too focused on creating great, informative videos but not making it obvious that I have a Patreon. But I do, so please consider supporting me on Patreon and YouTube memberships so I can keep doing this.
Oh, my feminist literature books. Not my feminist literature books. Man.
Every bit helps and you'll aid me in making highly researched videos just like this. By joining my Patreon, you will also gain access to my Discord server, where you can talk to me and others about all the deep-cut magical girls you probably can't talk about with anyone else. Otherwise, you could just subscribe to watch future videos with lots of information in them that you won't find anywhere else on the internet. Special thanks to all my $5 patrons, and fan art of the day goes to Try Me Playa. Reference sheet and other links can be found in the pinned comment below. Thanks for your patience, and on with the video. Toei was in a weird spot after Naja had concluded. Hiromi Seki would not return as a producer for the next show in line. Junichi Sato had been a freelancer for a while now, but left Toei after Doremi to pursue more of his own originals. And it wouldn't be until 2018 with Post-Precure that he would direct an anime at Toei again. His friend Takuya Igarashi would also leave Toei a few years later, and joined Studio Bones in 2006 with Ouran High School Host Club. In fact, he's still working at Bones to this day directing Bungo Stray Dogs. The original Izumi Todo lineup has broken off into completely separate ways. You could attribute this to the financial disappointment of tomorrow's Naja, but actually, Naja wasn't even the original planned follow-up to Doremi. First, I want to take a quick moment to give a shout out to anime historian Yoshihiro Morikawa. His doujinshi has helped me a lot with my own research, and I want to give proper credit to his efforts. The following part would not have been possible without his work. At a time when the anime and manga for Sailor Moon were already completed, it still continued in other mediums such as musicals. The popularity of these musicals would rise when Sailor Moon reran on Japanese television in April of 2000. Reruns are of course commonplace across the world. I know I'm not the only one who memorized entire seasons of SpongeBob scripts through them, but they are also a great way of using old material to gauge public interest. In some cases, we see shows coming back with new seasons after successful reruns on television. To grab a prominent example from the shoujo demographic, Aim for the Ace benefited heavily from reruns. It saw a reboot in the late 70s and came back once again in the late 80s to adapt more of the manga. If you think waiting a couple years for more Jujutsu Kaisen is agonizing, try waiting a decade and a half, then several more decades for it to finally get subtitled. The success of the Sailor Moon rerun stirred the pot for a new adaptation. The idea would be to make the next Sailor Moon project a follow-up to Magical Doremi. However, due to the request of author Naoko Takeuchi, the next project would not be an anime, but a live-action series. Commonly referred to as Pretty Guardian Sailor Moon, or PGSM, it's a retelling that shakes things up a little bit. Being a live-action tokusatsu series, the designs are the most immediate standout. Usagi only has her iconic hairstyle in her Sailor Moon transformation, which feels a bit weird at first, but Usagi obviously still acts like Usagi, so I didn't find it too distracting because she's still in character. What some may find distracting though is the presence of Luna. She's portrayed as a literal marketable plushie in most of the shots she's in, and in full CG whenever she has to move around. It is jarring, to say the least, and it's not the type of low-poly PlayStation type aesthetic that's cool to like now either. This is what a lot of CG looked like back then, and we just accepted it. Personally, I like CG animation a lot, especially from this era, so even though it doesn't look great, I still like it. The show itself is a lot of fun too. I never got into tokusatsu big time like I did with anime, but PGSM has everything that I do love about the genre. It has that very rudimentary editing and filming to it, the kind where I can just feel the time crunch they were under, so they just grabbed whatever shots they thought looked cool and slap them together. I mean, it's not too far off from how I make my own videos. All I do is just click buttons in my editing software and mess around with my camera until I get something that I think kinda looks cool. I don't have too much else to say about PGSM because I only watched a couple episodes. I guess the opening is pretty sweet. I like that it's different. Nothing will ever be as iconic as Moonlight Densetsu, but honestly, I can go a couple lifetimes without hearing that song again. Sailor Star's opening clears anyway, and I will hear no other opinions, unless you wanna leave them in the comments anyway. Go ahead, give me more engagement so my video can get promoted, and I win at capitalism. Wait, hold on, did I forget something? Oh, you want a synopsis? Oh, come on. I don't mind summarizing Doremi and Naja, but you already know what Sailor Moon is, so let's move on. Takeuchi famously had quite a few problems and nitpicks with the anime. This was an issue that slowly developed over time. She can be seen overjoyed about the anime from her interview on the Laserdisc of the original series. And then a few years later, she starts revealing some gripes about the depiction of the tuxedo mask, for instance. A lot of the staff who worked on Sailor Moon would go on to work on Magical Doremi, including Junichi Sato and Takuya Igarashi. With this information in mind, one could easily come to the conclusion that she denied the creation of another anime adaptation as to not run into the same problems with the old staff. But I also believe it was done for the sake of variety. Takeuchi had always wanted to do a live-action series since the Sailor Moon anime began airing. Sailor Moon already takes elements from Super Sentai, so it'd be a no-brainer. They got Shinichiro Shirakura to produce it. He had previous success with Kamen Rider Agito and Ryuki, who were not only popular with kids, but also women thanks to their handsome male characters. Obviously something Takeuchi wanted for her tuxedo mask. And now is the perfect time with the newfound hype behind the series. This also contextualizes the existence of Tomorrow's Naja. They couldn't do Sailor Moon as an animation, so Hiromi Seki used her experience and success with Doremi to her advantage. Naja was a story she wrote in 1986 inspired by the literature she was reading as a student. She would have been 15 when World Masterpiece Theater started airing, and it was still going strong in 1986 when she initialized that story. Most World Masterpiece Theater shows also starred young girls, which would have fit right in with the current lineup anyway. But unfortunately, just like with Naja, the live-action Sailor Moon also underperformed, despite being highly anticipated among fans. I'm going to speculate for a bit and say that pre-established fans of the anime were not as excited about this iteration. In Japan, the popularity of the original Sailor Moon anime was largely in the hands of Ami for a while. Sailor Stars was also not aired as a part of the Sailor Moon rerun, causing the Laserdisc prices to skyrocket. Longtime fans who had gotten into Sailor Moon through Ami's initial popularity were probably really attached to the anime. People who had recently gotten into Sailor Moon through the reruns may have been disappointed in Sailor Stars not airing, and didn't want to start anew when the series was nearing its finale. During the original run of Sailor Moon, Junichi Sato's own daughters were way more into Anpan Man. Yeah, the same one that BTS made a song about on Love Yourself. It's always been a massively popular show with kids, and there's always going to be a tidal wave of content to compete with children's attention. Kids who love Sailor Moon are going to hyperfixate on it and pretend to be the characters. Everybody else will do the exact same thing with another show they like. So Toei had to switch it up once more with their next series. They commissioned a new producer first and foremost. So who better to make the producer for what would become one of Toei's biggest franchises than somebody who came from a completely different background?
Imagine if Ninja got a low table fade. Imagine if Ninja got a low table fade.
I found a job opening for a mid-career producer at Toei Animation in the Asahi Shimbun, but I was not interested in animation at all at the time. Although I remember liking Mazinger Z as a kid, so I thought I would take the job. Toei Animation picked me up by chance. I accepted a variety of jobs as long as they were in the visual image field, regardless of the genre.
Producer Takashi Washio is often cited as the father of Precure. It's a statement that isn't entirely wrong, but also isn't entirely correct. I'm going to be crediting 3 people as the founding fathers of Precure. They're the ones you usually see together in crosstalk interviews when talking about the creation of Precure. But first, more on Washio and how he became a producer. I already mentioned how he came from a completely different field. That would be in the field of news and police reporting. Not what I would have expected, but it turned out to be a valuable experience for one particular project. Among his first anime producer roles, such as Ultimate Muscle 2 and Fishing Fool's Diary, he also worked on the Kindaichi Case Files, a detective anime about the titular Kindaichi Hajime who solves mysteries. It's one of those anime that's not too well known outside of Japan, but is massive natively if its original 148 episode run and several reboots is anything to go off of. During Kindaichi's initial run, Washio would meet up with director Daisuke Nishio. He was more of a Toei veteran, having worked at the company since the early 80s. Every director has their special touches that make them distinct. Akitaro Daichi has his hot and cold directing style combining comedy and drama. Naoko Yamada utilizes strong body language and defines their characters by the way they move their legs. For Nishio, it's his painstakingly meticulous attention to detail. He's the type of person to study every small detail of every facet. Nagisa plays lacrosse, so whenever there was a game in town, they would watch it and ask the players to join the recording session. Nishio wanted realistic cheering sounds from the audience for the show. That's the level of detail we're talking about. This was an area where Washio could reflect on his childhood to help in development. His past job experience would sometimes even come in handy.
The director said to me, "I wonder how the police set up a cordon to protect the crime scene." I had worked as a police reporter in my previous job, so I explained it to him and he said, "Please tell me more." I remember that clearly. I thought there might be some things I can do with this company.
Both of them had little to no experience with girls media. Nishio's only real foray into anything shoujo was with Pataliro in his early days. The rest of his career would mostly consist of long-running shonen and seinen anime. To his credit, Pataliro is a good one, being the first BL anime to ever hit Japanese television. He is the real deal. The same cannot be said for Washio at this point, who had no experience whatsoever making anime for girls. But coming from a different field meant he also had a unique set of sensibilities that both of them shared. Washio felt that as long as he got to work with Nishio again, it would turn out okay.
So in the end, I felt I could work with Mr. Nishio and do what I like and he would be happy. When we worked together on the Kendaichi case files, I really felt indebted to him. I included a line in the proposal that said even girls want to be wild. My first idea was that it would be cool if Kikaider and Hakaider worked together to fight. I loved Kikaider as a child and wanted to do a version of that for little girls.
For his proposal, Washio mainly had two things in mind that he wanted to do. He wanted to make an action show and wanted the main characters to be a duo in black and white. The idea of a duo came from his affection of detective dramas where duos are common for solving mysteries together. Washio points towards the show Tommy and Matsu and Walter Hill's 48 Hours starring Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte for inspirations from this field. The color palette was something radically different from magical girls of the past. Black and white had been incorporated into color palettes before Precure. Magical Emmy had black and white as part of her outfit, just not her whole outfit, which breaks up the pattern. The other two examples I can think of are Saint Tail and Nurse Angel Ririka SOS. Saint Tail is a bit tricky because her highlights are more of a burgundy, which makes me think that she comes off as black even though it might just be more of a shading thing. Mamie only appears as Saint Tail during nighttime, which helps accentuate it too. The manga art, on the other hand, does not seem to have this conundrum, so maybe I just don't know color theory. Ririka's outfit, meanwhile, is more of a 50-50 between white and pink, so I guess you could count it if you want. But up until Precure, there were no magical girls that were predominantly black and white. Still to this day, it's not a combination we really see. The only other obvious example would be Magical Girl Lyrical Nanoha, which misses the mark for being the first by coming out later in 2004. But the colors weren't only significant for being the first instance of that combination used in a Magical Girl series, it's also a statement. Let's look at the transformation sequence. It opens up on a rainbow veil covering the screen until it gets devoured by light and darkness. They shout dual aurora wave and begin transforming inside of that rainbow vortex. Their chromatic bodies are contrasted against the colorful background. Compared to something like Sailor Moon, where the characters are flashing rainbow colors on top of a colorful background while transforming. Looking at the rest of the genre, some other magical girl anime like Mermaid Melody do a similar approach. A lot of others display their characters as shadows or silhouettes while transforming to add some mystique and anticipation to the transformation. Wedding Peach, Nurse Angel Ririka SOS, and Tokyo Mew Mew all do this. The chromatic bodies in Precure to me appear to symbolize advancement. They use the sort of shadow technique in a new way to make it more sleek and modern. It rejects traditional color use and looks towards the future. Precure would break away from a lot of traditions and also make a lot of its own. Nishio and Washio may not have had a lot of experience with girls media, but they were determined to make a good program for children. There were rules set in place for what they could and could not depict. For example, Precure as an action show for kids had numerous workarounds for violence. They wanted to display powerful attacks without making any of the fights feel replicable in real life. Kids want to be like their idols, and magical girls have always been an especially strong influence on both girls and boys alike. Therefore, fight scenes have to be meticulously crafted as to not encourage children to be violent. Precure gets around this by putting up a lot of safety nets. The Cure's faces could not be hid, and any blow towards the abdomen had to be blocked. Power is instead shown through impact. A character might get launched into a wall from knockback. That way, you get the point across without damaging their faces or anything a kid might feel intimidated by. They knew they couldn't just replicate exactly what Sailor Moon did a decade earlier because kids now might not accept it. For another example, while I wouldn't call Sailor Moon a scary show per se, it did have some horrific imagery here and there. The weekly enemies were based on Yoma, a Japanese word for monster. Some of them take on a more demonic look to make them feel more imposing. It makes sense to make the villains threatening, but I wouldn't be surprised if Morga in the very first episode gave some kids nightmares. A part of Nishio's rule against violence was also to not include any unpleasant imagery in general. The Zakenna in Precure are imposing more so in their size rather than appearance. They round out all the edges in their design to make them convincingly threatening to the Precure without necessarily being scary to a young audience. You don't want the kids watching your show to turn off the TV because a monster was too much for them to handle at their young age. Where they do sort of follow in Sailor Moon's footsteps though is in how they defeat the enemies. Pre-Precure Marble Screw is like a Moon Tiara action type attack they use to finish off their opponents. It's a staple of Magical Girl anime because the attacks look cool and give the audience a catchy line they can chant alongside the hero. Precure's depiction of defeat also takes a slightly different approach from Sailor Moon, because instead of making them friggin' disintegrate, the Zakenna split off into multiples and apologizes, with only the main servants being the ones who disintegrate when defeated to give up their prism stones. I like to see the interaction between the Zakenna as a way of teaching kids that you would rather get a bully to apologize to you than letting violence be the end-all be-all. The fighting style of Precure can be summarized as being influenced by wuxia, or Chinese martial arts. Whenever you see gravity-defying combat in anime, that's probably where it comes from. This happens to be Nishio's specialty. Washio may have met him through working on Kindaichi together, but he's most known for Kusunojo's story from Tokuma animated video book. I don't get why it's not on my anime list though. Did they miss it? Are they trying to hide the real Kino? Like, they have all of his other stuff that nobody cares about, like Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball, rest in peace Akira Toriyama. Oh yeah, he directed Dragon Ball. That's definitely one for the record. And I'm not talking about this joke, because this joke sucks. So, did Dragon Ball influence Precure? Sort of. I'm not gonna act like Precure doesn't take anything from Dragon Ball because it obviously does in many ways. Both have similar ways of depicting power. Dragon Ball has people not only flying into walls, but also getting shot through mountains. Precure undeniably co-opted this technique. However, I cannot attribute it to Nishio specifically. This was already a technique used in the manga, so it's a Dragon Ball thing that was transferred into Precure. Precure Marble Screw, I would say, is more of a homage to Dragon Ball. The obvious point of comparison would be the Kamehameha, though I'm a bit apprehensive to say that's where they got it from because beam attacks like this have existed for a long time in tokusatsu. Ultraman, for example, finishes off his enemies using his signature Spatium beam attack. Maybe Washio wanted hand-to-hand combat like in Kamen Rider with a finishing move like in Ultraman. Where I believe Nishio's touch comes into play is when Marble Screw collides against enemy attacks in later episodes. Like in Dragon Ball, they channel their strength to make their attacks more powerful until they are able to overpower their opponent. That's probably about as close as Precure ever gets to being like Dragon Ball Z. In terms of fighting style, Nishio's previous show, Air Master, is much more indicative of the combat scene in Precure. Air Master is an anime about street fighting. The main character, Maki Aikawa, the titular Air Master, specializes in aerial combat. The source of her fighting style came from her past of being a gymnast. She would often get hurt by zoning out mid-performance, so her mom advised her to suppress her emotions as to not get distracted. However, Maki's desire to become a professional gymnast plummeted after a depressive period over her mom's passing. She now roams the street to find new challengers and also hangs out with her friends. Having been a gymnast, her moves involve a lot of that gravity-defying action and legwork. Some of her signature moves are rapid kicks, putting people in headlocks, and dive attacks. As a seinen series, they don't need to stray away from violence, along with the occasional bad scene. But combat is drastically different from a lot of Dragon Ball previously. The stuff they do in the show obviously cannot be replicated in real life, but comparatively, it's a lot more grounded. That's to say you won't see any Kamehamehas or anything, just physical strength and agility. So is it more like the original Dragon Ball then? Also not really. Hand-to-hand combat in Dragon Ball is often really fast. Repeated animation is frequently used to sell you on the speed of the battle. This works great for a long-running shonen where they crank up the pacing for a hype showdown after enough downtime of dialogue has passed. It's just that those moments can be few and far between when you're so neck and neck with the source material. The Airmaster manga had already been serialized for 7 years, and the anime was only 27 episodes. This means they probably had a lot more breathing room to think out interesting choreographies for each fight. Paired with the fights being a lot more stripped down, combat as a whole becomes generally slower and more methodical. Each hit packs a lot of punch, the sound design is beefy, it feels more cinematic. What it reminds me of is the work of Akira Sugino. As an animation director, he would do a lot of these slow-mo shots to raise the tension of the scene. This would end up being the same direction Precure takes for a majority of its battles. And Precure doesn't have to worry about getting caught up to any source material because it's an original. So the staff's own imagination and stamina becomes the limit for which Precure can be created. The slower pace works great too because shoujo anime in general tends to be a lot slower paced compared to shonen battle series. To make the expressions and acting from the characters really sink in and make an everlasting impact. This is another aspect where Precure borrows from Airmaster, mainly Maki's image of being a gymnast. Bits and pieces of this would end up getting integrated into Honoka's movements, who was also modeled after a gymnast and ballerina. This is also in contrast to Nagisa, who was modeled after an athlete to better suit her tomboyish personality, which came from Washio's childhood of being a sprinter in track and field. Analyzing their movements, you can tell how subtle the differences are in the animation. Nishio's attention to detail and personality here is immaculate and worthy of high praise. He obviously did not storyboard and draw every frame of the anime, but this is the kind of thing he really cares about if Kindaichi is anything to go by. So, we have a producer and a director. The schedule at the time was tight, with Nishio wrapping up the final few episodes on Airmaster and storyboarding the final episode himself. Washio had pitched his initial idea near the end of June 2003. He had asked Nishio to direct in July of that same year. They were developing the story and laying down the fundamentals for the programming on the side. Now all they needed were some character designs that kids could latch onto. Washio held an audition where he would request a sketch of whatever the artist wanted before receiving any instructions. This narrowed it down to one person.
I received an offer before the Bond Festival, so I gave up my Bond vacation and went to draw. I submitted the proposal on August 17, 2003 and received a response on August 25, 2003.
And with that, we have our complete trifecta of Precure's founding fathers. But the Cure Black and Cure White that we all love today did not always look like this. Akira Inagami's initial designs were inspired by previous anime in the same time slot. In short, a lot of Yoshihiko Umakoshi influence. He was the character designer for the trendy drama trilogy and had his breakthrough with Magical Doremi. Umakoshi coincidentally also happened to be the character designer for Airmaster, and we would later see what his take on Precure would be with Heartcatch Precure. Nishio was the one who decided to go with Inagami, so the question then becomes, why Inagami? Why not go with somebody whose career was on fire at that point and also had prior connections with Nishio? Well, Umakoshi was busy working on Akitaro Daichi's second season of Jubei-chan. Important times, as he delivers one of my favorite interview quotes of all time. I believe most men have a secret desire to get beaten up by a pretty woman. Bars. Inagami didn't quite have the same resume at the time, but he did have an extensive history working at Toei. Not that most people would know, because he rarely made it into the credits of his earlier works. In the public's eye, he's seen as the Precure designer at best if people are willing to acknowledge him. Today is the day I will put an end to that and reveal that Inagami is not only a brilliant illustrator and animator, but also that he's been way ahead of the curve for decades now. And for a long time, only one person really believed in him. This is the story of Akira Inagami, and how Junichi Sato thought he would be a big hit with kids. Akira Inagami was always a Toei kid. His first recollection of being interested in animation came when he went to the Toei Manga Film Festival with his dad as a kid. It was a festival in which Toei would screen 5 to 6 movies in a day. These usually ran for between 2 and 3 hours and would comprise a lot of TV episode length movies, sometimes literally showing episodes aired on TV in a theatrical format. But the main features would usually be double or triple the length of these episodes. It was here that Inagami would be first acquainted with Toei's movies, such as Puss in Boots and Horace. Anime was not the only thing they would play either. They would sprinkle in some tokusatsu in between. Inagami cites Kamen Rider as an inspiration for when he would later draw the villains in Precure. Growing up with these films through the film festivals and showings on TV, Inagami would later discover more about the industry in his teenage years. 1978 marked the year that Animage began publishing. Animage is a magazine that's still running to this day, and specializes in news about anime and information about the people working in the industry. He picked it up because he was a fan of Space Battleship Yamato and thought the cover was cool. In that issue, he would read an article about Toei's animation course. While he was interested in animation at a young age, he didn't seriously consider becoming an animator until the latter half of his sophomore years of high school. He would get enrolled into the Osaka University of Arts, and he just so happened to end up in the same department building as Hideaki Anno and his colleagues, who would later go on to form Studio Gainax. Inagami described the atmosphere to be exactly like that of Kazuhiko Shimamoto's manga Blue Blazes, which was about his years working at the same university. Inagami did not join any clubs, but he was impressed by the works of his colleagues. So much so that he went to see their short films Daikon 3 and 4 on video. This is what cemented his desire to move to Tokyo to become a professional animator. In his 4th year, he received information that Toei was recruiting animators. It was the perfect opportunity to join, so he applied and passed all of the tests. Inagami's first couple of series that he worked on were US co-productions like Jim Henson's Muppet Babies. At this time, they couldn't fit all of the names of the people who worked on a show in the credits. He would find himself disappointed when he didn't see his name because he couldn't show his parents. But he kept on doing these co-productions for some time until he got to work on Hello Kitty. The chief director was none other than Junichi Sato, who would become his senior for 5 years. One day, Sato asked him if he had a minute to talk and would proceed to give Inagami a lesson on perspective. This was an incredibly important moment for Inagami and made him want to put even more effort into his drawings. It also solidified a good friendship with Junichi Sato. Inagami's first time working as a character designer was on The Red Mailbox on the Mountain Pass. It was a part of that Tokuma animated video book anthology that I made a joke about earlier. It was an anthology series made by young creators. The first term students got to take on the main role of directors, and the first and second term trainees got to work on animation direction and character design. Daisuke Nishio did the other episode I mentioned, and Junichi Sato worked on Red Mailbox in 1990. I don't have footage of this anime, but looking at the VHS cover, we can see his characters on display. It took some time for his designs to get approved, because the staff at Tokuma Shoten weren't impressed by his first drafts. Junichi Sato, on the other hand, saw a lot of potential in him and knew his characters would be appealing to kids. If anything, he was way ahead of the curve. Boy Shoddy over here has a very soft look to him that we didn't see too much of at the time. The closest resemblance that I can think of is some of the stuff that Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata worked on in the 70s. If I squint at it, I can maybe see a little bit of Future Boy Conan in it. If I squint even harder, I could maybe see Labyrinth Labyrinthos by Rintaro in this screenshot, but I think that's stretching it a bit. Overall, it feels a lot more reminiscent of what we would see 10 to 20 years later with these fluffy slice-of-life anime like Strawberry Marshmallow. Inagami would spend a good chunk of the 90s animating for Dragon Ball Z on Minoru Maeda's team, who also complimented Inagami's drawings. But he would get at least 2 more chances making original designs before the 21st century, and both would be with Junichi Sato as director. First in line was a short film called Super Baby that was screened alongside the Blue Legend Shoot and Sailor Moon S movies. Sailor Moon was clearly the main attraction as the longest movie, clocking in at an hour long. Blue Legend Shoot, meanwhile, was the length of a TV episode, and Super Baby was only 15 minutes. It is also the only one of the 3 to not be released on home media. So once again, I have no footage of this movie, but I found at least one thing of note from online summaries. The movie is basically a transforming hero story where the villain of the movie, Bakuguba, puts a curse on a park swing, turning it into an evil minion to fight Super Baby. This would later become a foundational element for the villains in Precure. Inagami recalls Junichi Sato having his first child around the time of making Super Baby, so he believes it to be a very sentimental work for him. Perhaps this is why he later brought Inagami on to work on Crayon Kingdom for him, which in return prepared him to design all of the fairies in Precure. He used all of the knowledge he built up working on all of these shows to deliver one of the most diverse cast of characters up until that point.
Working on Precure right after Doremi would have been difficult. I think drawing taller characters in Tamara's Nadja helped me prepare. For Precure, I thought I had to use everything I had up to that point. For the gags' faces, I used Doremi as a reference. As for the fairies, I think I was able to use the roundness of Crayon Kingdom and other works, or in other words, my original taste. There are also elements of Dragon Ball present. It was truly an all-out effort.
I'm sure you also got along really well with Nishio and Washio in general. I can picture them all bonding over growing up with Mazinger Z together. Nishio believed they had a strong lineup because they didn't get into arguments about creative differences. It was less about what do I want to do and more about what should we do when developing the series. This leads us to our second rule, which is that swimsuits and panty shots were strictly forbidden. Now would be a good time to put your kids to sleep because the following segment might be a bit inappropriate for younger viewers. Everything I show will be censored here on YouTube, but you can watch this part uncensored on Patreon for educational purposes. If you are sensitive to these topics, feel free to skip ahead to when I turn the lights back on. See you on the flip side. Okay, so I watch a lot of magical girl anime, and as much as I love them, I greatly appreciate Precure's efforts in this approach. I have absolutely nothing against explicit content in anime, especially when it's the main focus. If all the characters are half naked on the cover and throughout most of the show, then great, sign me in, I'd love to watch it. If not, and it's more unassuming on the surface, then you'll be servicing a portion of your audience and potentially turning off the rest from it. And if it's a show made for kids, then it should be reserved for natural occasions that don't put anyone in a sexual context. I think Mobile Suit Gundam is a great example of how to depict nudity in a non-sexual way with a narrative purpose. Never once while I was watching it did it feel purposely titillating or distracting to what the episode was actually about. They are just naked because it can show vulnerability in a way that simply isn't possible to do otherwise. It doesn't treat nudity as some sort of unholy sanctity because the human body is not inherently a scandalous object. It's how you portray it and the context around it that matters, which is where some of these older magical girl anime run into some problems. I remember the first episode of Pastel Yumi having an especially egregious example of this. Basically, it revolves around this contest at a carnival. Yumi's dad enters it with a flower dress that Yumi happens to accidentally destroy prior to the showing. They try to rebuild it, but it breaks again on stage. So Yumi uses her transformation magic to change into a new pretty flower dress that ends up winning them the competition. Only there's a catch. She can only use magic for so long before it wears off. So her dress vanishes as she's in the middle of the stage in front of a giant crowd, and it's not even played off as a joke or anything, and then the episode just ends right afterwards. And then they do it again in the next episode. Unsurprisingly, magical girls of this time had a massive otaku audience, some of which were deep into the not-so-kid-friendly stuff that doujin circles would make. Regardless of what your opinion on such material is, I think we can all agree that it's highly inappropriate to put that kind of fanservice into a show made for kids. If Japanese Wikipedia is anything to go off of, it seems like even the female staff of Pastel Yumi took issue with the show's sexualization. This was something that Washio and his team sought out to rectify. I like to see the point about banning swimsuits in Precure as a direct response to Cardcaptor Sakura, because while it has nothing in it that is inherently sexual, in between everything else, it also has some of what you can call otaku bait in it. Tomoyo's obsession with Sakura opens the floodgate not only to shipping, but also maybe some self-projection. She's into photography and filmography, which many otaku are also into. She's the one who makes all of the costumes for Sakura to wear, naturally leading to many having their own favorites. People really latched onto the cat outfit for its moe appeal and cat girls being popular in anime culture. Then of course we have the school swimsuit. These two outfits became a popular topic for many sinful figures, doujins, and drawings. I can't say for sure if that demographic was deliberate or not. For director Morio Asaka, it was absolutely not the intention. However, clamp originally came from the doujin sphere, making Captain Tsubasa and Saint Seiya doujins. So they could be cool with it for all I know. You never know what people are going to latch themselves onto anyway. There have been some measures taken to avert that kind of audience in the past though. Sailor Moon popularized what are called Bishoujo characters, beautiful women basically. Several staff members from Sailor Moon, including writers Sukehiro Tomita and character designer Kazuko Tadano, would go on to work on Wedding Peach as a spiritual successor of sorts to Sailor Moon. But whereas Sailor Moon had a number of panty shots throughout the show, director Kunihiko Yuyama banned them from being used in Wedding Peach. So that was one visual component they got rid of, although the core design philosophies of Sailor Moon are still present in Wedding Peach. Author Naoko Takeuchi notes that the sex appeal of Sailor Moon came from Japanese men being weak and wanting to be dominated by the Sailor Scouts. In an article from the September 1993 issue of Animage, there was an interview with Kazuko Tadano about her thoughts on character design. She notes that men are better at capturing the sex appeal of female characters and how she also wishes that she was better at drawing women more erotically. Like it or not, sex appeal was a big element to what made Sailor Moon so popular. So naturally, when it came to developing the OVA, Wedding Peach DX, which was more intended for the male audience as noted by original author Nao Yazawa, not only is the sexual content punched up from the TV series, it also throws out the rules initially set by Yuyama, who also wrote the OVA and includes panty shots in it, so it was an attempt, while it lasted. Before the Bishoujo boom following in the footsteps of Sailor Moon and multiple eroge, lolly characters became popular in the wake of Hayao Miyazaki's Castle of Cagliostro, more specifically with the character Clarice. If you watch the movie, you can literally hear Lupin calling the Count a lolicon for trying to marry somebody half his age. The 80s would see an explosion in lolly characters both in TV series and adult animation. The most famous example from this initial lolly boom would probably be Minky Momo, also directed by Kunihiko Yuyama. Unlike Wedding Peach, where they dropped the ball with the OVA, Minky Momo tried to course correct itself over time. Takeshi Shudo, the creator of Minky Momo, saw a comment in a Japanese magazine talking about how Minky Momo was made with lolicons in mind. This made Shudo completely shift gears with the writing of the second half of Minky Momo for Damage Control. But it was too late, and Minky Momo had already cemented its place in the otaku fandom. Some official products even play into the sexualization that Shudo tried to prevent. Otaku are known to spend a lot of money on merchandise and physical media. Wanna know why I have this manga called Bondage Japan? The name of the doujin circle is Miki Makimura Corporation, which is the name of a character in Devilman. I thought it was mildly interesting at the time I bought it, but after looking up the name on Google, I found this manga called Yuri-chan's Journey of Love, which has this weird Minky Momo ripoff character on the front, like a DeviantArt OC or something. But this is how the underground thrives. They make fanworks of already existing characters or their own contorted versions of them and bank on your affection towards these characters to buy their products. It's a case of trickle-down economics where the original creators provide the main official products, and if you want something more niche, sometimes it exists officially, and other times you'll have to consult these doujin circles or make it yourself. Some series, like Toho, really thrive off of their art and doujin communities, so back then, it may have been a necessary evil to keep some of these shows profitable. Distancing Precure from those types of fans could arguably have been seen as a risk at that point. It was a new original property which was made after a financial disappointment in a genre where otaku could be seen as a considerable backbone. But the reality is that some people will sin no matter what. There is a rule for it on the internet. You know, the 34th one. All you can really do to dissuade that content from being made is by not giving them anything to work with, so they have to work hard for it. Instead of swimming, Nagisa is into a land sport, lacrosse, because Washio played it as a kid. They wanted to get rid of panty shots and any possibility of them happening while still having dynamic camera angles. Cure Black was given a pair of undergarments under her skirt to prevent this, and Cure White scenes were more carefully storyboarded than, say, Airmaster, where the panty shots are a lot more deliberate. White's dress is also a lot longer than Maki's skirt, so her fights never really feel all that compromised as a result. Alright, lights back on. And that'll be it in terms of adult content for the rest of the video. This stuff is really important to me and I find it interesting, but I hope I didn't make you feel uncomfortable with any of it. There is one more thing I want to quickly go over before moving on to the third part where we discuss the writing of the show and where the third rule is going to come into play. And that is the process in recruiting voice actors. Inagami had an idol-like image in mind for Cure White, so they wanted Cure Black to be a contrast to that. Nagisa is played by Yoko Hona, whose first anime roles were with Studio Ghibli, the first of which being Taiko in the second best Ghibli film Isao Takahata's Only Yesterday. You'll also recognize her as Shizuku from the lo-fi hip-hop beats to study and relax to movie, aka the best Ghibli film, Yoshifumi Kondo's Whisper of the Heart. The most iconic song from the movie is her take on John Denver's Take Me Home Country Roads, which would become a big hit in Japan, reaching number 21 on the Oricon charts. Before Ghibli, Yoko Hona had been a child actor since the mid-80s. Here she is in Kamen Rider Black from 1987. She's featured in episode 32, titled Dream Girl Yuki, in which she plays the titular character. The villains are basically trying to brainwash a bunch of children to join their side using magic mushrooms. They use illusion magic to fight Kamen Rider Black, but in the end he's victorious and saves the day. It was a pretty decent episode, and her acting was alright for being so young. I could still tell it was the same person who would go on to play Cure Black. But what I found the most interesting about this episode is the image of Kamen Rider Black retrieving Yuki back to her father. It made me think of a line that Nagisa said from episode 22 of the original Pre-Cure.
私は小さい頃バトルレンジャーになりたかったんだよね。渚らしい。
I want to believe that Yoko Hona wanted to play the hero role after that episode, with this line being a remnant of that desire. Yukana, meanwhile, was a veteran voice actor in anime. She even had previous cred in the magical girl genre, playing Angel Lily from Wedding Peach. She was the perfect contrast to Yoko Hona's more unrefined performance. Yukana also had prior experience working with Nishio, having played Maki's friend Mina in Airmaster. Her performance as Honoka in Pre-Cure reminds me a bit of Tomoyo from Cardcaptor Sakura, ironically even more so than Mei Ling, which is the character she actually played in that series. It's that very high-pitched professional tone with a calm and collected attitude. Fits well for both of them being honor students. It's also a bit funny considering Mina in Airmaster canonically has a crush on Maki, which is never quite reciprocated, just like Tomoyo and Sakura. I don't have too much more to say about Yukana's performance other than it's great, and she and Hona both perfectly complement each other's positive attributes. Pre-Cure also had a very unique way of recording voiceovers. What set it apart is that they didn't have a sound director. Instead, the director and animation director would be the ones giving voice directions. This sounds like it would be a complete disaster, but it was because of that imperfection that gave the series its signature soul. Yoko Hona's previous work on Whisper of the Heart was already an emotional and vulnerable performance. Now let's pair that rawness with her actual nervousness auditioning for the series. Yoko Hona and Yukana coincidentally both auditioned together at the same time. Hands were shaking as they held the script. When Hona got to the part where Nagisa was announcing her wish, Yukana knew that she would be the perfect fit for Nagisa. In a few ways, she plays a similar character to that of Whisper of the Heart, just punching up a lot in certain aspects of the emotions because it's a kids show. Their relationship outside of the studio was also very healthy, as they would frequently go out for dinner together and celebrate each other's birthdays. Similarly to the unique recording method, Washio also had a unique casting method. He casted his crew based on what people would create the most enjoyable working space. They all got along back then, and they still do now. In the Pre-Cure 20th anniversary book, Yukana talks about how they still hang out with the people who worked on the show several times a year. If that isn't wholesome, I don't know what is. It was a production where people loved each other, loved working on the show, and loved its rooted inspiration in tokusatsu. Yoko Hona had her roots in the genre, but Tomokazu Seki, who plays Meppel, was also a big fan of tokusatsu. They were really able to bring that enthusiasm to the forefront, which made it an irresistible watch. And with our staff assembled, we can move on to the next part.
Every kid with autism, 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 kid.
Late 2003, Inagami had just finished his character designs. Nishio wrapped up his work on Air Master, working on Precure on the side while storyboarding the final episode. Washio was also hard at work creating the concept for what would become Precure. As previously mentioned, Washio was big into tokusatsu, even more so than anime. You might also remember me saying Naoko Takeuchi got Shinichiro Shirakura to produce PGSM. His previous Kamen Rider efforts with Agito and Ryuki, alongside Kuga prior to both of them, started a renaissance for Kamen Rider in the 21st century. Before Kamen Rider Kuga in 2000, Kamen Rider had been on hiatus for about half a decade. Since the revival, the series has been going strong with annual entries up to present day. But considering the time frame, this means that they were slightly ahead of the curve with Precure. The thing about Toei is that they love nostalgia properties and paying respect to the past. Washio himself was producing an Ultimate Muscle sequel prior to Precure. Ultimate Muscle's original anime started in the 80s, had a sequel in the 90s, and continued with Washio's version in the early 2000s. Ultimate Muscle wouldn't be the only property to receive a revival every 10 years or so either. On the Magical Girl side, Akko's first anime came out in 1969, had a revival in 1988, and another one 10 years later. Kamen Rider's hiatus was not as long, but when it came back and eventually released concurrently with Precure, they would see synergy being played in the same block, Nichiyasa Kids Time. Precure airs on Sunday at 8:30 AM, and Kamen Rider comes right after. Washio's tagline for Precure was "Even girls want to be wild." With Kamen Rider Ryuki and Agito's popularity with women, this approach for Precure only made sense. But is it all that dissimilar to Sailor Moon? On paper, not really. The thing about Magical Girl anime and the anime industry in general is that it's typically very male-dominated. So even if it's a property that's adapting from a shoujo manga, most men only have so much context for what women respond to. You can read the pages and not understand all of the underlying nuances of the character writing. This was a bit of an issue with Sailor Moon. Morikawa mentions in his book how the writing staff for Sailor Moon was very male-dominated. They didn't quite understand Tuxedo Mask the same way Takeuchi did, which led her to later get a female writer for PGSM. In an ideal world, I would want more women in the anime industry to take on major creative roles. That should go without saying. But at most, you typically have female staff informing male directors and writers about how to properly portray women, as is the case with Agitaro Daichi, for example. But measures were also taken to do research on what kind of stuff girls were into at the time. Precure was no different, as acknowledged by Washio. Going back to the character designs quickly, Washio originally wanted to try a gothic Lolita look for the Cures, but wasn't sure if young girls would be interested. So instead they worked on studying fashion magazines for inspiration. But for everything else, they took a different approach to the writing. Being in the same time block as Kamen Rider, they wanted to bridge the gap for both audiences, and make something that both boys and girls could enjoy. This leads us to rule number 3, modernizing speech and breaking down typical gender expectations.
When I look back on my childhood, I used to play with a girl in my neighborhood from my class without really thinking too much about it. Reminiscing about those days, I thought there might not be much of a difference between boys and girls when they are preschoolers, and it would be a good idea to suggest things that I liked to girls. So I consulted with the director and started this project.
Gender scrutiny has always, and unfortunately probably will always, be a thing to some degree. You can even be cynical and see Precure's monopoly over this time slot as a step back from decades prior. Back when various shoujo manga like the trendy drama trilogy was allowed time on air to let their stories flourish over the year. It's been a point of contempt for some fans who seek more variety in the magical girl genre today, but really, I think it's what makes the most amount of sense. Since I was a kid, I was always into girly stuff. As a small child, I loved Winx Club, which probably made me gay. I always wanted to grow my hair out super long, and I was drawn to the cutesy aesthetic of girls' toys and their commercials. That stuff has undoubtedly influenced many of my sensibilities, but being a kid who grew up in the 2000s, I dealt with a lot of gender dysphoria due to the landscape of normalized homophobia and sexism. Going to an all-boys school for a good portion of my youth only made things worse. Remember, this is back when calling somebody gay and other various homophobic terminologies was a common insult. So while I was often being ostracized for being a boy who was into stuff that girls liked, the few times I did get the chance to talk to girls as a kid, we usually got along pretty well. It's like what Washio said, we really aren't all that different. It's just systematic pressure that can sometimes divide people, which is why it's especially important to have a positive influence on children at a young age. And kids shows are easily the best way of going about this. Doremi and Naja were great at this because they weren't afraid of cutting deep and portraying sometimes uncomfortably real situations. They were handled by some of the best people in the industry, which is the kind of respect you need for an impressionable audience. I would argue kids shows are not only the most important shows ever to be made, but also some of the most difficult to make. For as much as I love the works of Junichi Sato and Takuya Igarashi, for example, the older series they were attached to sometimes had a couple shortcomings with outdated character writing. One of these I remember standing out to me was in Tomorrow's Naja. Episode 27 sees Naja and a side character named Kinosuke who gets into a feud with her over burned food. They start bickering at each other like kids do, and it's portrayed pretty accurately to how kids would handle this situation. The issue comes when they are encouraged by the rest of the Dandelion troupe to apologize to each other. More specifically, the gesture they use. When Naja is told to apologize, Grandma simply says, "You should be mature and apologize." A perfectly valid response. For Kinosuke, on the other hand, the focus is instead put on his gender. "Be a man and apologize to her," they say. To the show's credit, for the time period Tomorrow's Naja takes place in, it's a realistic response, but as a show airing in the 21st century meant for kids to watch, it only plants that idea in their heads. That you have certain expectations put on you depending on your gender, which is not something you had control over when you were born. I didn't learn about transitioning either until I was a teenager, and at that point, I was hesitant about the idea. Growing up, I had always been told I should act like a man, so I tried to force myself to see myself as a man. My feelings were never taken seriously by my friends or family, and I was practically an afterthought right after my sister was born. I've had bad depression since I was a small child, but because my dad would always scoff at me when I tried to describe it to him, I would just try to suppress my emotions, not unlike Maki from Airmaster, albeit in a different context. When I got on the internet, I felt more comfortable decorating my online profiles with the kind of feminine aesthetics I grew up feeling attached to. This was at a time when blingies were super popular, which helped define a lot of my aesthetic tastes. I was often mistaken for being a woman, which felt liberating and exciting. No longer did I have to burden myself with my physical appearance and anatomy. I could be my own idealized version of myself that I had always wanted to be. People could see me for who I wished I could be and not who I forced myself to be. And then reality hit me when I would get bullied by my classmates for how I would portray myself online. It discouraged me from ever thinking about transitioning again, even though I finally felt happy with how I portrayed myself. It was something I couldn't quite achieve in real life because my mom would always force me to get my hair cut really short. This sucked because when I discovered anime, I was inundated with gender-swapped and non-binary characters. Krona from Soul Eater and Elsie from To Love Ru, these were characters I loved but also envied. Since then, I have found peace identifying as non-binary since a few years ago, and I finally have my hair below my shoulder length. Even so, I still force myself to accept my male pronouns in real life since it's easier than explaining what being non-binary means, and because of this, I actively avoid talking to people in person. I keep myself isolated, devoid of human touch. The only reason I don't completely hate it is because I rarely got to feel it growing up, and I got used to it. Because I always had this idea that I shouldn't be sensitive and want something like that. That my feelings don't matter because I don't matter. No one liked me because I never even got the chance to discover who I was and learn to like myself. All of this emotional turmoil I went through came out of sayings like "just be a man" from my classmates and family. The only reason I had all of these expectations put on me was because of what I have in between my legs. It's both emasculating to what they were trying to accomplish and dehumanizing because we're all vulnerable in our own ways. And attempting to strip down that emotional sensitivity is tearing down your own humanity. And this is all just from my own upbringing. I don't want to potentially misrepresent any struggles that women go through, but you're free to share your own experiences, regardless of what you identify as. Either way, this is something Nishio explicitly wanted to avoid when writing Precure. It's really his defining role as a director on the series because he only actually directs 2 episodes himself and only one of them is storyboarded by him. So his job is less about encompassing a specific aesthetic and more about maintaining this consistency in writing. I'll draw a point of comparison to episode 27 of Naja with the fan favorite episode 8 of Precure. Both episodes are centered around the same basic premise of two characters getting into a fight with each other. In Naja, it's because she was in charge of cooking for that day. She was distracted by the kaleidoscope she got from Francis in the last episode. Naja has a crush on Francis, and Kinosuke has a crush on Naja. Kinosuke's vitriol towards Naja partly comes from that jealousy. Similarly, in Precure, Nagisa had seen Honoka with Fujimura in the last episode. It is established that they were both childhood friends. Nagisa has a crush on Fujimura, so she's insecure thinking about him and Honoka possibly being interested in each other, as well as getting down on herself for not being as smart or elegant as Honoka. Because Nagisa's instincts are fueled by petty, self-centered desires, it becomes difficult for her to confront Honoka about how she feels. This reaches a boiling point when Honoka tries to introduce her to Fujimura. Nagisa has already been shown to be shy about confronting him, so she is uncomfortable with Honoka pushing it onto her. Failing to acknowledge those insecurities, Nagisa reaches a breaking point when she says their relationship is nothing more than just being Precure. This moment comes right before the eye catch, meaning we're halfway through the episode. In Naja, we basically just started the episode, which means Naja has about 20 minutes to resolve things, and Precure has half the episode left. Going back to Naja, I already explained how the Dandelion Troop reacts towards both Naja and Kinosuke and how they are treated. They both come to the realization that they overreacted and decide to apologize. As they wait for the other to take the initiative in apologizing, Naja hits it off by saying, "Why don't you just be a man and say it?" To which Kinosuke replies with, "Being a man or a woman has nothing to do with this." Naja strikes a bit of a nerve with that condescension with the way he responded, despite not knowing how the troop responded to Kinosuke. This attempt at making peace then fails when Kinosuke decides to walk off the scene. Once again, this scene is played out in a realistic way that I can see happening in real life. Admitting you're the one at fault is a sign of vulnerability, so it can take a lot out of you to admit it. Precure handles this wonderfully when Honoka starts avoiding Nagisa because of her harsh words. It's not that they're angry at each other, they both genuinely feel bad for what they did. Honoka starts to withdraw herself from Nagisa whenever she sees her, and Nagisa begins to reflect on her own words too. Eventually, Honoka confronts Nagisa with an apology, but she does so by giving up her card commune to Nagisa and running off. After a few more failed attempts to confront Honoka, she gives in when Nagisa is getting attacked by Gekidrago. In the face of the enemy, this is the moment they start bickering at each other like Naja and Kinosuke. The card commune only allows transformations to be made if both Precure are present. Precure is potentially the only magical girl series I can think of that features two characters together in a transformation sequence. It puts emphasis on their bond, which makes it the only opportunity they have to properly talk to each other, as they can't transform and fight alone. In the Naja episode, they are also given an opportunity to properly talk to each other. The Dandelion Troop plans out a road trip that if Kinosuke does not participate in, he'll get kicked out of the group. Naja is already present on board the vehicle with her sewing machine, but we do not get to see how she was persuaded. They head towards a massive sunflower field and are immediately dazzled and seemingly forget about everything. We get a really cool backstory from Kinosuke where he got separated from his sister and met a man who wanted to fly. His name was Chuhachi Ninomiya, based on a real person in Japanese history. He was a pioneer in model aircrafts in the late 1800s while also serving the military. In real life, Ninomiya's father passed away when he was only 12. Kinosuke would have probably been around the same age when he first met him. Ninomiya was successful in making a couple planes that could only fly very short distances, but was later distraught to find out that the Wright brothers made headlines with their Wright Flyer model plane. In Naja, he's seen broken down into tears at the prospect of not being the first. They spin it into a positive story about still aiming for your dreams even in the shadow of failure. Ninomiya in real life would later pass away from stomach cancer in 1936, but his portrayal in the anime was still able to inspire Kinosuke into becoming a mechanic, which is a big part of his character. The episode concludes with the both of them making a gift for each other and finally apologizing. Overall, it's a fantastically written episode with lots of great ideas. It uses a lot of clever motifs to enhance the drama and make the tension between the two more believable. Earlier in the episode, a character named Rita tries to spell the word apple on a piece of paper, but gets the spelling wrong. It's a tricky word for a kid to spell, so when Kinosuke later fixes Abel's typewriter, Rita wants to have another go at spelling it. Naja already typed her name in as a way of testing it, so Rita then types in Apple, which is short for Naja's full name, Naja Applefield. That's legitimately top-tier characterization and writing. So it sucks that such a well-written episode has those few lines that set it back. There is purpose behind everything, but they also brush some things under the rug. The episode is incredibly lopsided in Kinosuke's favor. This both highlights the condescending comments made against him and also makes Naja a less interesting character in the context of the episode. Kinosuke never even apologizes in the episode. He has the bravery to tell his story to Naja, so can you just trauma dump to somebody and have them forgive you for it because you're going through a lot? Kids can be pretty quick to forget things, especially when they are presented with something they like, but that is not a good lesson to teach. George tells Kinosuke near the end of the episode that if you want to put a girl in a good mood again, a present should work every time. This is also a horrible way of going about it because then you could just try to guilt trip them into forgiving you through materialism. I've had instances where I've been in a fight with somebody and they try to give me something later in return. It's hard to accept when we both have some level of apprehension towards each other, and now I'm gonna be reminded of that moment every time I look at that gift. That's not to say that's the only outcome. Sometimes a gift really can be a mood booster, but it's something you should never rely on. The only way to fix a broken situation is by confronting it yourself with good thoughts and intention. Going back to Precure again, this is exactly what happens. The enemy practically becomes an afterthought as they effortlessly dodge all of his attacks in the middle of a conversation. They land on a point that they mutually agree with, and that is that they are practically complete opposites. They quickly finish the battle using Precure Marble Screw and completely deleting Gekidrago. On one hand, I find this incredibly funny because realistically in these shows, wouldn't you just use your insta-kill move as soon as possible? So it's very amusing to see them doing it just to get it over with, but it also leans into that build-up this episode has had. Even after coming out victorious, they still don't talk to each other and go home with their supplies. Except, they just so happen to get their notebooks switched up. When they get home and start reading them, they become smitten by each other's words. Nagisa was encouraged to write by Mipple, who said she might have an easier time sorting out her thoughts if she put them down on paper. They start off being very simple. I like chocolate. Studying is boring. My socks are a little smelly. Just kidding. Nagisa has been on Honoka's mind a lot, so her writing is a lot more contemplative. I made her angry by doing things I thought would benefit her. She and I are completely different, but it's fun being with her. Despite Nagisa's own insecurities about herself, she does in fact have something unique to present to Honoka, and vice versa. Nagisa's final words are, "I love friends. I hate fighting. I want to know more about Miss Yukishiro." Honoka's final words are simply, "I want to be friends with Miss Misumi." Next day, they gather at the same spot where they had their fight to return each other's notebooks. Without even needing to apologize, they get along with each other once again, and the episode ends right after. This episode beautifully encapsulates the anxiety of teen drama. My complaint with the Naja episode feeling lopsided is gone. Both characters are equally given enough screen time and context to fully flesh out the story. The use of notebook communication is brilliant because getting your intents across in the heat of the moment can be very difficult. Writing has the potential of being a lot more vulnerable because you're staring at a piece of paper instead of into somebody's eyes. There's no social pressure, so you can let your heart bleed as much as it needs to. They also read it out of their own volition, meaning they could easily avoid it if they so choose. Most importantly is the messaging of this episode as a whole. Before this episode, they would refer to each other by their last names, which is commonplace in Japan. Referring to somebody by their given name is a sign of being very close to that person. In anime, you'll typically see couples and family members referring to each other by their given name. Nagisa and Honoka practically are family with their ties of being Precure, but it's also a sign of their genuine relationship and respect for each other. Teaching kids that you can still get along with somebody even if they're completely different from you is such an important lesson. It's something I think a lot of grown-ups could also look into if I'm being honest. Your differences with somebody should ideally be complementary because it offers a different perspective. This is the pillar in which Precure is built upon. It marks a turning point that shapes the rest of the series. For Naja, an equal point of comparison would be the episode prior to the one we just looked at. Without giving away any spoilers, in episode 26, Naja finds out the true identity of a certain character which completely alters her character trajectory for the rest of the series. Everything she knew about this character is flipped on its head. It was also a big turning point for director Mamoru Hosoda, as it became his swan song from TV anime. After episode 26 of Naja, he's been exclusively making movies for the past 20 years. You have him to thank for Wolf Children, and he got his start working at Toei. Episode 8 of Precure, meanwhile, was directed by Takuya Igarashi, who also directed Tomorrow's Naja. He didn't direct episode 27 of Naja himself, but I think his greatness in Precure is accentuated by Nishio's strict writing policies. Even if you don't follow who wrote or directed what episode, you can tell episode 8 is a standout. Yoko Hona even said it was the episode where Nagisa really came to her, and I think that really sums it up. I'd argue it's the single most important episode in the entire franchise. There are several episodes later that call back to it. Episode 40 has a wonderful scene where Nagisa and Honoka are having a sleepover. In the dead of night, they reminisce on their journey up to this point. The way it's framed is so beautiful. Nagisa says, "We've learned so much and dealt with all kinds of problems," as the visuals portray their battles against the evil henchmen. Honoka's reply then redirects it to the episode 8 incident, saying, "The worst one was back then." I'm not ashamed to admit that I started crying. It's such a reaffirming moment which puts things into perspective of how much they've grown together. I would also call it a brilliantly veiled recap, something Precure does arguably better than any other show I've ever seen. Even though Nagisa and Honoka are presented as a duo, it really is Nagisa's story. She opens each episode with an inner monologue about what happened last episode. It's a kinetic way of keeping viewers up to speed without feeling like a waste of your time if you're already caught up. It's just a thing that I appreciate. Something I also love are these title cards. I feel like people don't respect them as much as they should. Anime nowadays doesn't really use title cards or eye catches that often anymore, but I believe it adds a lot to the atmosphere and pacing of the episode. The way it opens up on a sketchbook animation paired with Nagisa's inner monologue makes me think the story is being told from a greater outside perspective. Tomorrow's Naja did something similar, but it's a lot more obvious with it. With Precure, I feel like that interpretation becomes a lot more valid on repeated viewings. You don't really notice it at first, but going back to it is like opening and reading an old book. Fitting considering how they both write in their notebooks, so this could be like reading their diaries. Another standout episode is 42. You can see it as a follow-up of sorts to episode 8. The premise here is that Nagisa and Honoka are forcibly separated from each other. It's after they have already transformed, so they can technically still fight, but the real fight becomes their struggle in self-belief. A really heartbreaking moment is when Nagisa starts losing hope in the situation. With Meppel being the only one on her side, they play a game together called Shiritori. A player has to say a word, and then the other player has to think of a different word that ends in the last character of the last word. In Japanese it would be the final kana of the last word, but as an English example, if I say banana, you could say nature. However, you cannot say names or places. One of Meppel's characteristics is that he ends all of his sentences in meppo. As Nagisa struggles to think of any words ending in po, Meppel tells her that she can also use ho. The first thing that comes to mind is Honoka. This is incredible wordplay similar to what we saw in Naja, and here it has even more thematic relevance and magnitude. She's literally at a loss for words thinking about Honoka, but it's precisely that state of despair that in turn empowers Nagisa into becoming a more competent fighter. She plows through Zakena on her own because she is still more than capable of fighting on her own, she's just doing it for a more personal cause now. She's being selfish, and that's a good thing. Selfishness is about prioritizing yourself above other people so that you can empower yourself into a state of radiating the same energy onto other people. In episode 8, Nagisa was merely being petty and insecure about her feelings towards herself. She was willing to cast aside what she had with Honoka because she saw Fujimura as more desirable to herself. Now Honoka is not only the most important person to Nagisa because they're simply friends, but from all the ways they have impacted each other. Together they can do the impossible because they wouldn't be the same without each other. This makes their victory at the end all the more satisfying. Futari has many beautiful moments, and we'd be here all day if I were to go over everything. I've talked about what I consider to be the most important moments of the original series. Another episode I consider to be excellent is 28, the only episode both storyboarded and episode directed by Daisuke Nishio. But I'm gonna draw this segment to an end because you can watch those episodes and experience the wonder for yourself. That's not to say that we're quite done with Futari yet, but we're now officially going into post-Precure territories.
Conventionally, a series lasts 1 year, but in reality, the continuation is decided in 2 core units. So there are times when a series suddenly ends after 2 cores, and there is no guarantee that it will last a full year. Therefore, we were always prepared for the possibility of termination of a program before making the next installment.
There's a rumor that Precure was going to end halfway through the original series. The main antagonist was defeated at that point in the story. How do you continue a story that's already over? How is Precure still going to this day 20 years later if they were potentially only going to make it half a year?
What were they thinking?
I didn't even think about it. At first, I started with the idea of doing what I wanted in 1 year, and in order to do it for a year, momentum was important. So I told myself, collect 7 Prism Stones in 6 months, and what would I do with the remaining 6 months? The director told me I should think about it then.
The answer is you end it multiple times. The rumor I mentioned is false. They wrote the story into 2 halves deliberately, both as a way of preparing for cancellation were it to happen, but also keep things fresh and moving in different directions. Washio thought it would be boring if they dragged out the same scenario with the same characters for a full year. The second half, they can think about later. The second half of the original series then became about reviving the Dark King. When he was finished off by the Precure with the help from the Queen of Light, he scattered remnants of himself to plant new minions in his place. Not too dissimilar from how Zekena split up into multiple stars when defeated. The 3 new villains are a bit different from the original 5 members in the sense that they fight to seek freedom for themselves. This is the setup for the second half. Interestingly enough, it's also the setup for the sequel series Max Heart. When the Dark King was resurrected and defeated once more at the end of the original series, he took down the Queen of Light with him. With the Queen gone, it leaves the Garden of Light vulnerable. But with the fall of the Queen, they also gain a new ally in her place. Enter Hikari Kujo, or Shiny Luminous, who bears the life of the Queen. Similar to how the Dark King split off into 3, so did she. The Heart is represented by the throne she sits on. Her aspirations take the form of the 12 Heart Eels, all representing different emotions. These are all needed for the resurrection ritual. Hikari isn't just a damsel in distress either, with her also fighting alongside the Precure. However, she is notably not a traditional cure. The reason for this at the time was that the role of Precure should be reserved for characters who could be considered ordinary. Since she originated from a divine deity, she cannot be a Precure. Her mystical origins also play into her personality. Since we've grown so attached to Nagisa and Honoka at this point, Hikari is a welcome addition, and seeing her trying to fit herself into society is one of my favorite parts about Max Heart. Overall, I think I actually enjoy Max Heart a little more on a moment-to-moment basis from episode to episode. It somehow feels like they were utilizing their female writers more when they were writing the scenarios. I can't quite pinpoint what it is. I think Max Heart just does a better job at feeling more like a typical magical girl anime. For some, that might be a turnoff, so take that as you will. I'll admit myself that despite enjoying Max Heart, I think its existence is a detriment to the original series in some ways. Let me explain. Precure now operates under season themes and a new cast every year to keep things fresh. But Max Heart follows in the structural footsteps of Sailor Moon and Doremi, where it's the same cast and story with new characters introduced each season. Doremi handled the passing of each season pretty well, I'd say. The story doesn't have the same earth-endangering stakes that the other 2 have, so the transition becomes pretty seamless. Doremi being an original meant that they also didn't have to butt heads with any external authors. Sailor Moon, meanwhile, had a bit of a rough period going into R. They probably did the best that they could with their circumstances, but starting off a season by giving the characters we grew to love amnesia makes it so it takes some time to get going again. Max Heart also takes a few episodes for Hikari to fight as Shiny Luminous, but the problem isn't necessarily the pacing. The ending of the original series was perfectly fine as is. The part about Mipple and Meppel wanting to stay in the human realm despite losing their sentience as a result was a powerful moment. It's like the equivalent of dealing with the loss of your pet or a loved one. Not only is it heart-wrenching, it's also a bold and strong message to pass on to kids. Loss is something you're just gonna have to learn to endure one day or another. So when they come back again in Max Heart, it distracts from that lesson. To the credit of the creators, I don't see Max Heart as some sort of cash grab. In some ways, it pulls away from the original series by the virtue of its existence, but the execution of everything else is still remarkable. Shiny Luminous being a non-cure means that she serves a very interesting role in the overall story. Nagisa and Honoka had been shown to be capable of fighting independently, but still require the presence of each other to transform. Shiny Luminous is more independent, being able to fight enemies completely on her own. At first I was a little worried she might dominate the show, however I was pleasantly proven wrong. Nagisa and Honoka at this point in the story are kind of going through the motions with each other. They don't have the same significant mutual growth as the original series, but that was the point of the original series. Max Heart is purely an expansion pack, and thus expands Nagisa and Honoka's characters through Hikari. She may occupy a significant amount of screen time and narrative focus, but her presence is also in service to Nagisa and Honoka. In a way, I see her introduction as being similar to that of Porun in the second half of the original series. Porun was sort of a wild card because Wisdom stored the Prism Stones within him before getting kidnapped. With the power of the Prism Stones, Porun was able to summon the Rainbow Bracelets for the cures, which acted as sort of a power-up. Porun was unreliable though, because he would always get lost somehow, and come in clutch when the cures needed him the most. Hikari meanwhile is more dependable as a fighter, and can empower the cures by performing a 3-pronged attack with them. I personally enjoy both characters a lot, with Porun being more unpredictable and funny, and Hikari being more mysterious and cool. They both take up a lot of the spotlight when they are introduced, but the story never loses track of Nagisa and Honoka. I think Porun later becoming Hikari's personal fairy spells everything out perfectly. Another crucial element to developing a new season of an already existing property is keeping things fresh. I've talked about Shiny Luminous being an exciting new addition, but the roots of Max Heart really lies in its ties to the original series. Pretty much every episode can still be enjoyed out of context like the original series, but Max Heart seeks out to revisit many episodes from its prequel. While not every episode is homogeneous of its origins, the ones that are generally do a good job of expanding upon or recontextualizing the original episode. To give an example, episode 37 from Futari and Max Heart has Nagisa and Honoka acting in a play. In Futari they played Romeo and Juliet, and in Max Heart the theme was Japanese history. The theater director of the plays is their classmate Shiho, who wants to become a Hollywood film director. She gets some character development in Max Heart when it's revealed that her parents are discouraging her desired career path. But that doesn't stop her ambitions. Shiho represents the excited young director type who always wants to experiment with new techniques. Despite the time crunch, Shiho wants to implement wire action into her play, inspired by Chinese wuxia action. In both episodes, they are stopped mid-performance by the villains, but that unpredictability is what ends up winning over the audience. It's a funny episode that worked once and made even better the second time. The name Max Heart came from their schedules being tight and working up to their deadlines. Under that pressure, this take on episode writing made a lot more sense. And to be fair, a lot of those episodes dealt with traditional Japanese holidays that are in, like, every anime, so I think it was a smart approach. The second half definitely felt more oriented on this idea, and simultaneously, it's also where the story kicks into overdrive. Episode 21 of Max Heart introduces a similar scenario to episode 26 of Tomorrow's Naja. It marks a monumental shift in the story that divides it into two halves. Up until this point, we keep seeing shots of the same mansion the villains in the second half of the original series inhabited. There's a lot of emphasis put on this Johann Liebert looking ass kid. What is his purpose? Why is he with the villains? When I saw him for the first time, I had a hunch he might be connected to Hikari in some ways, because they're both like the only characters with blonde hair. Episode 21 proved my assessment correct. Even though I called it early, I think it's still a great setup for a kids show. They lean into that mystique that the original series had at discovering more about its lore. With that being said, I found the ending to Max Heart to be a bit disappointing though. After the official revelation made in episode 21, the story just sort of paddles along for a bit until the final arc. This is the portion of the series where they put more of a focus on referencing past episodes, as I mentioned. That stuff is all fine, but the reveal was already made. Their connections are brought up several more times past episode 21. It feels more like stalling for time so you can end the series with a big climactic fight. Then the ending end of the series hints at Shiny Luminous having to sacrifice herself to resurrect the queen, but after the big climactic fight, Hikari is still around. Something I thought would work off of what they did with Mipple and Mepple in season 1. It could have made for an emotional moment like with Mipple and Mepple in the first season, but they didn't go all the way and it just felt really lame to me. Instead they go for an endless everyday type of ending similar to Doremi. The girls graduate and the ending of the series is the end of what we see of them. It's not exactly what I wanted, but I can appreciate it in another way. It lets us appreciate what we went through with these characters while leaving room open for interpretation. What are they gonna be like in another year from now after spending more time with Hikari? Is Nagisa ever going to go out with Fujimura? Is Honoka ever going to go out with Nagisa and make the real shipping dream happen? Our imagination can make stories seemingly endless, but a production with the same staff who made it cannot go on for an eternity. That's why Nishio stepped down as director for the next entry in line, Splash Star. It was still being produced by Washio, but it marked the first major shift in the franchise itself. Washio holds a very sentimental view of the series. However, it failed to meet the sales expectations from Max Heart. To put it into context, the year Max Heart aired, it received 2 feature films. It also had some serious celebrity status. In the first movie, the Queen of the Garden of Hope was played by Shizuka Kudo of Onyanko Club, an all-female J-pop group which was popular in the 80s. 5 years prior to the movie's release, she had married Takuya Kimura of SMAP, another massively popular boy group. Imagine BTS if B stood for Boomer. The second movie featured a group that had debuted the prior year, Berry's Factory, who performed the ending theme. Members Mari Yaguchi and Saki Shimizu were both previously in the popular girl group Morning Musume. Not only that, they appeared in the movie as themselves as a cameo. Japan's insanely dedicated idol fanbase made a sensation out of this at the time and most certainly contributed to the box office success. It was also a major development in anime films, as Yokohama notes that this was the first time an anime film for girls was screened independently. Sailor Moon wouldn't even receive that luxury. Splash Star would follow suit in this approach of hiring celebrities for voice roles. Takeyuki Godai would go on to play the main antagonist Aku Daikon. Godai was famous for being a popular actor in various daytime dramas. This made him popular with Japanese housewives who would probably be watching the show with their kids. Now all they had to do was sell enough toys and merchandise to stay profitable. Precure debuted in a changing landscape. The card commune from the first season became a retail hit. Trading cards were nothing new at this point, with several popular card games on the market while being easy and cheap to mass print. Sales had reportedly hit over 1.5 billion yen by the end of December of that year. But a new challenger was approaching, and that was Sega's hit arcade game Lovenberry. It was a rhythm game that incorporated trading card elements in a similar vein to something like Aikatsu or Prepara. Different cards gave you different outfits and accessories to wear in the game. This paired well with arcade game culture as a social activity and wanting to have a high status in skill or appearance. Losing out to Lovenberry, as well as other card game oriented anime like Mushi King being on the rise, led them to discontinue the card commune in Max Heart. The executives at Bandai still believed in the series though. They wanted Precure to be a hit series that would last over 10 years just like Super Sentai. Yes, Precure 5 is what most people would consider to be the first major shift in the franchise. Not to underplay the significance of Splash Star, but it wasn't a good look for the series on a surface level. It's essentially what Nintendo would go on to do with the Wii and Wii U. You have a successful brand, so you want to stick with the same naming scheme to appeal to your previous user base. Although in reality, it just makes things more confusing for the consumer. Infamously, the two main leads from Splash Star look unnervingly similar to the ones seen in the original series. Most people who look back on the franchise still have the same reaction. It's basically the first thing people talk about with Splash Star. So building upon Bandai's wishes of turning Precure into a female Super Sentai, Yes 5 introduced a team of 5 fighters. Missed opportunity to get 5 for Fighting to do the music though. This would go on to be the standard for the rest of the series, with a few exceptions that revisit the formula set by the first 2 entries. With Yes 5, Washio would also begin to take a step back as a producer. Fresh Precure was the first in the series without Washio's involvement. It is also notable for introducing the iconic CG dance sequences used for the EDs. This would go on to be another staple of the franchise, franchise, and is something I suspected they took inspiration from Naja. Honestly, after seeing Toei's Girls Band Cry, I would love to see an entire season of Precure animated in 3D using these models. Might be wishful thinking though. Washio still does planning and is occasionally a producer on the franchise, but new talent is what keeps it interesting and exciting to this day. That being said, I think there still is something to be said about Precure's dominance in its own time slot. I love Precure and I wouldn't want it to stop, but I also miss Hiromi Seki's contributions. She made many interesting shoujo series that she already enjoyed as manga blossom with beautiful anime adaptations. My introduction to Ai Yazawa was not through Nana like most people now, it was Neighborhood Story. I don't care if it doesn't follow the manga to a T, because the opportunities she made and the staff she put together made for an incredibly compelling show. In a world where there's a lot of debate about shoujo being dead or dying, a wide variety of high-quality anime adaptations are more than welcome. This is something we used to see all the time back in the day. I don't even necessarily agree with the notion that shoujo has been on the decline because new stuff is always coming out and flying under the radar. I'm really enjoying Vampire Dormitory this season, for example, and nobody seems to care about it, but we aren't really seeing full-year adaptations of shoujo manga anymore. Ones that deviate from their source material to sometimes make an even better adaptation. There's a level of intimacy that only 12 or 24 episodes simply can't provide in the same way. Even though I'm thankful for what we already have and having been a part of that era, I do miss it. I don't want to end this video on a downer though, it simply is what it is. If I'm being objective, Precure is the best consistent formula Toei has had for this kind of show. The name branding may be the same, but no two seasons are going to be exactly alike. It offers more variety than something like Doremi, even if I do like Doremi a lot more overall, but would Doremi still be as good if it ran for 20 years? Would I want it to continue for that long in the same way as Precure? I don't think I would. Precure has the antics and aesthetic to make it an enjoyable weekly watch without overstaying its welcome. The current season airing right now is Wonderful Precure. What exactly makes it stand out? Yeah, this made waves in the community. The teams at Izumi Todo are great at making a great first impression. Soaring Sky Precure last year was notable for having the first male cure. They keep finding new ways to innovate, and Wonderful Precure is no different. It's been an interesting experience because the things I like about it are going to be the reasons why a lot of people won't, and the things that don't click with me are what's going to be the highlights for many others. I'll say what I like about it first. Okay, so the theme for this season is animal care. It wouldn't be a good look for the Precure to harm animals, so combat instead takes a pacifist approach. The animals get brainwashed into what are called garu-garu. The Precure have to heal them back to their original form through sympathy. So instead of each enemy encounter being a hype showdown with cool sakuga, it's more concerned with playing with your emotions. I think this approach is fresh and going to have a lot of potential for the rest of the show. As for what I didn't like as much, well, this one's gonna need some explaining. So my whole life, I've always had a fear of dogs. Every neighborhood I've ever lived in has had a ton of dog owners. I hate it when I'm just, going by my day and suddenly a dog starts barking or jumping at me. It jump scares me every single time. I don't go outside so I can relive Five Nights at Freddy's. So does that mean I'm more of a cat person? Considering most of my cat experience came from picking up cat poop off the floor and dealing with allergies at my ex's place, not really. I think I just don't like pets around me in general. Animals make me feel incredibly anxious because they don't respect personal space the same way a human can. Therefore, there are a lot of aspects about being an animal lover that I simply don't relate to. That alone would, of course, be a stupid reason to dislike a show, so I went in with neutral expectations. And I gotta say, as a resident pet not enjoyer, Wonderful Precure is alright. I think they do a good job of presenting the best traits of animals that make you want to own a pet yourself. Komugi's animalistic traits highlight her dog-like tendencies even as a human. I think she's the most fun character in the show because of her high energy and ditzy nature. I could go into more specifics about the show, although I don't want to say too much considering it has yet to conclude. But if what I said sounds appealing to you, definitely give it a watch. We all have our favorite seasons and eras of Precure. Whether it be the nostalgia of the Bush years or the optimistic future of the Biden years, there's a cavalcade of content to enjoy. I myself like like the Obama years of Precure the most, but that's what's so great about it. Any season could be someone's favorite. It's an anime franchise that stands on its own and should be respected for its many breakthroughs in the industry, and it all started here. Now, can some of y'all stop being so mean to all the boys in the series? You know exactly who you are. What did Cure Wing ever do to you? Think Shoddy from One Pre is gonna hurt you? He probably has the same strength as SpongeBob trying to bend a straw. Get real. This is a series about equality, not discrimination. It didn't run for 20 years for some people to use it as a vessel for sexism. I'm gay.